The chamber was built to make visitors feel small. That was Erebos's first read of it, not awe, not admiration. Just a cold professional note filed away in the back of her head the moment she stepped through the doors. The ceiling vaulted upward 300 ft, biological architecture grown rather than built, ribbed with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in slow rhythmic waves. The light was calibrated, too soft to be functional, too precise to be accidental. It made everyone look like they were standing inside something alive, which she supposed they were. She walked in alone, no aid, no escort, just Era and her boots on the floor and the quiet sound of 17 civilizations deciding what to make of her. In the first 8 seconds, she gave them the full 8. Didn't rush. The conclave of 17 sovereigns met in the Verith Dominions capital station, a structure so large it generated its own gravity field and its own weather patterns. Somewhere above this chamber it was raining. Era had noted that on approach. She had also noted the docking configuration, the emergency corridor spacing, the load-bearing columns along the east wall, and the fact that the main doors opened outward, a design choice that said a great deal about how the Verith felt about exits. She found her seat. Third tier, center position. Neutral ground theoretically. 17 delegations arranged in a sweeping arc, each one distinct biology, color, scale. The particular way they held their bodies in space. The Kashan reach sat in clusters of 4, all angular limbs and formal silence. The Emranathi floated in sealed atmospheric pods, their shapes shifting and uncertain behind the glass. The Sulavar delegation had brought musicians, which Era thought was either a bold diplomatic statement or a scheduling error. She sat down, poured water from the carafe at her station, drank it, and felt them looking. It wasn't subtle. It never was. She had stopped expecting subtlety approximately 15 years ago. Around the third time, high-ranking official had visibly flinched upon being introduced to her. The scars on her face were extensive. She knew that, had known it so long. The knowledge had calcified into something neutral, just a fact about the shape of her head. They ran from her left temple, down across the cheekbone, branching at the jaw. Her neck carried a different pattern, broader, the kind left by something structural falling rather than something sharp cutting. Her hands were the worst, or the most, the knuckles deep with old damage, the kind that had healed as best it could and then been used again before it finished. She opened her briefing folder. The first page was a complete military and economic profile of every delegation in the room. She had written most of it herself, cross-referenced against intelligence reports and shipping manifests in 3 separate conversations with people who were technically retired and technically not still working. She started reading across the arc in the position of central prominence that required no announcement because the room's entire geometry directed attention toward it. Sat Sovereign Thessalivar, 8 FT of bioluminescent authority. The Verith were tall as a species, narrow and luminous, their skins cycling through colors that carried meaning. Threat, calm, curiosity, contempt. Thessalivar's current palette was a slow, considered blue gold that Era had been briefed meant something like, "Times I have already decided this." She looked at Era. Era turned a page in her briefing folder. The assessment took perhaps 4 seconds. Era had been assessed by experts. Thessalivar was thorough, systematic, and completely undisguised about it. The gaze moved from Era's face to her neck, to her hands and back, and the color, cycling in her skin, shifted fractionally towards something that Era's briefing notes described as times pity shading, into confirmation of prior judgment. In plain language, they sent their broken one, Era read, about Thessalivar's economic policy, and drank her water, the younger A2. Stations to the left of the Varith Prime. Seat leaned to his colleague. Era didn't hear what he said. The colleague's mouth moved in what, across species, registered as a suppressed smile. She didn't need to hear it. She had read that particular body language in 17 languages now, and they all said the same thing. They said, look at the state of her. They said, humanity sent this. They said all the things people say when they see damage and call it defeat. Era made a note in the margin of her briefing folder, not about the aid, about the water pressure in the building's pipes. She had felt it when she poured a slight surge, a micro hesitation in the flow. Old infrastructure, or infrastructure that had been expanded faster than its supply systems could accommodate. The Varith station was growing, which meant they needed the transit corridors more than they were going to say in there. Good. She turned another page. The ceremony of opening was long, because it always was. Each delegation had a speaker, and each speaker had prepared something, and several of them had prepared something long. Era listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention that looked to anyone watching like patience. It was not patience, it was calculation wearing patience's clothes. She noted who deferred to whom before they spoke, who checked the Varith delegation's reaction before and after their own statements, who had come with a position and who had come with a performance. Most had come with a performance. When it was her turn, she stood, stated her name, her title, her mandate from the Human Consolidated Council. 41 words, sat down. Several delegates exchanged glances. They had been expecting more. They had been expecting, at minimum, a statement that addressed the scars, an acknowledgement and explanation, the kind of narrative framing that said, times I know what you're thinking, and here is how to think about it. Instead, she offered nothing. Lord Adjutant Pyron of the Cashin reached 2 tiers up and already wearing the particular expression of a man who had preloaded his opinions and was simply waiting to deploy them, made a note on his tablet. Era could not see what he wrote. She had a reasonable guess. Thessalivar had not looked away. This was new. Most delegates, after the initial assessment, filed Era away and moved on. The sovereign was still watching with the focused, slightly narrowed attention of someone who had expected to solve a problem in the first minute and found the problem was not behaving as expected. Era found that interesting. She closed her briefing folder. Everything in it was already in her head, had been for 3 weeks since the moment she accepted this assignment. The folder was performance, and performance had its place, but right now she was done performing. She looked out at the chamber, the great ribbed ceiling, the slow pulse of living light. She thought about the water pressure in the pipes, about what it meant for infrastructure, for expansion rates, for need. The Varith had built this room to make visitors feel small. Eravos had once spent 14 months rationing water, a collapsed military installation, while the enemy broadcast daily the names of her dead. She poured herself another Glass drank it slowly. The room could. Try harder. The first session started at the third hour and the Verith opened it. The way a trap opens beautifully and all. At once, Thessalivar did not stand too. Present, she had someone else stand, a prime speaker, tall and blue pale voice. Like a tuned instrument, who laid out the Verith Dominion's opening position. In language so careful and formal it took 11 minutes to say what could have been said in 2. The Verith Dominion was requesting that was the word they used, which was not the word they meant, the full withdrawal of human military presence from the Kethanara transit corridors, all 3 of them immediately pending ratification with a monitoring protocol to be determined by the Dominion. The prime speaker finished, sat down, folded his hands. 17 delegations waited. This was the part Era had been briefed on, not by intelligence reports but by the 3 people who had sat in this chair before her, her predecessors. 2 had escalated, 1 had made concessions before lunch, all 3 had been responding to the wrong thing. They had read the demand and responded to the demand when the demand was not the point. The point was what came after the demand. The point was the waiting. Every delegation in the room was watching to see if Era would bristle, if she would stiffen in her chair, if her jaw would set, if she would launch into the human prepared counterposition with the kind of clipped urgency that signaled wounded pride. It was practically a tradition now. The Verith had refined this opening. 4 consecutive human negotiators. They knew how it played. They had a rhythm for it. Era picked up the proposal document. She read it all. Of it, every clause, every subclause, every footnote. The room stayed quiet, because her stillness had a quality that made interrupting feel like a bad idea. The way standing too close to the edge of something high feels like a bad idea, even when nothing is pushing you. 3 minutes. 4. She set the document down. Which of these corridors does the Verith Dominion actually use? The prime speaker blinked. The corridors are sovereign Verith transit corridors for ships, moving things. Which ones does Dominion traffic actually move through? A pause. The kind that meant the answer existed and was inconvenient. The prime speaker looked back at Thessalivar. The sovereign skin held very still. No color shift, which Ara was beginning to understand meant clear's throat. She was thinking rather than reacting. After a moment, Thessalivar inclined her head. Permission. Quarter 7. Keth sees regular Dominion traffic. The prime speaker said the Inara secondary corridors are held as strategic buffer, not a question. Silence. Then we agree on 7. Keth. Ara said, we can revisit the Inara corridors if and when Dominion traffic patterns change. She moved her copy of the proposal to the left side of her table, the side where she put things that were handled, and opened the next item on the agenda. The room did not know what to do with that. Lord Adjutant Pyron made another note on his tablet. The Maranathi in their pods shifted. The particular way that Ara had been told indicated heightened attention. The Sulavar musicians had stopped playing at some point during the reading of the proposal and had not started again. Thessalivar watched Ara move to the next item with an expression that had changed. Still not warm, still not approving. But the contempt had rearranged itself into something more like observation. The sovereign was a collector of information. Something had just been added to her collection that didn't fit the existing categories. Aura presented the human position on the outer reach resource. Sharing protocols, clear, plain, no flourish. She had two counter-proposals prepared, one moderate and one aggressive, and had already decided she would not need the aggressive one because the moderate one was actually what the Vareth needed, and they would realize that once they stopped performing. The session ran 4 hours. Aura drank 4 glasses of water. During the midpoint recess, she stood at the window of the side chamber and looked at the city visible through the viewport, the Vareth capital spreading across the station's inner surface, curving upward at the edges in a way that always looked slightly wrong to human eyes. Buildings grown from the same biological architecture as the conclave chamber. Living city. An aide appeared at her elbow, young Vareth iridescent in the way the junior staff seemed to be. The older officials ran to deeper, steadier colors. Commander Voss, can I bring you anything? She didn't look away from the window. Topographic map of the Karoth system. Whatever the Dominion has on file. Pause. The Karoth system. May I ask what for? No, the aide left. Whether to find the map or to find someone more senior to explain why the map was being requested by the human delegate. Aura didn't know and didn't particularly care. The request would get back to Thessalivar. She had intended it to let them wonder. The Karoth system was by any practical measure completely irrelevant to the current negotiations. It was outside the contested zone by 4 light years. There was nothing there worth discussing except that the Karoth system shared a gravitational anchor point with one of the Enara secondary corridors, a fact available in any basic stellar cartography base, a fact that if you were thinking about what those buffer corridors were, actually buffering times against pointed in an interesting direction. The map arrived 20 minutes later, delivered by a different aide. Aura folded it into her briefing folder without opening it. She went back into the session. Afternoon moved through the resource protocols, a preliminary discussion on the mutual defense perimeter, and an extended procedural argument between the Kashan Reach and the Maranathi about sequencing that Aura stayed entirely out of using the time to read the topographic map under the table. The Karoth gravitational anchor was exactly where she had expected it to be. She made a note, small, marginal, the kind that looked like a personal reminder rather than a strategic notation. Thessalivar, she noticed, had sent the aide a query. The aide had responded. The Sovereign's coloring ran briefly through something that was not in Aura's briefing notes. Shade she hadn't catalogued yet. Not contempt, not assessment, something more careful than either. Aura capped her pen, put the topographic map away. The session ended without resolution on 3 items: partial agreement on 2, and a full agreement on the outer reach secondary protocols that the Vareth Prime Speaker announced with the careful neutrality of someone pretending they had intended this all along. Aura signed her copy, stood, nodded to the room. She was at the door when Pyron of the Kashan Reach said something to the delegate beside him. Low voice, but not low enough. Something with the word times, decorative times in it, and a specific cadence that meant it was meant to travel. Aura paused, opened the door, walked through it. The words followed her for about 4 steps. Then she was thinking about the gravitational Anchor again, and the word stopped. Mattering. And she walked down the corridor toward her quarters with the quiet focus of someone who had already moved 3 steps ahead and was patiently waiting for the room to catch up. The dinner was formal in the way that punishments are formal. Everyone dressed for it, everyone attended, and everyone understood that the real business was not the food. The Varath called it a gathering of understanding, which was a translation Ara found charitable. What it actually was, a structured social event in which 17 delegations were arranged around a table long enough to land a small aircraft on, served food designed to be edible across most known biologies, and expected to perform the particular theater of diplomacy that happened between the sessions, the softer work, the impression management, the careful positioning of relationships. Ara had been to 41 of these across her career. She had a system: sit near the center of the long side, accept the food, eat what was tolerable, say less than everyone expected, listen to everything. She was seated 6 positions from center left, which put her across from a gap in the table. Maranathi atmospheric pod, present but sealed, its occupant visible only as a slow movement of shapes behind the glass. On her left, a Sulivar cultural attaché who had been trying to make eye contact with her since she sat down, and who she had decided on no particular evidence was either very friendly or about to ask her something she wouldn't want to answer. On her right, an empty chair. The Kashan reached delegate who was supposed to occupy it had moved himself further down the table. She ate something that tasted like heavily seasoned grain and watched the room work. Lord Adjutant Pyron was 4 positions up on the opposite side, holding court in the way men who had never been tested hold court. The expansive gesture, the well-rehearsed timing, the audience of polite faces, doing the diplomatic mathematics on whether it cost more to laugh or not to laugh. He was on his 3rd drink. His color was high. He had the look of a man who had come to the dinner with something prepared. Ara drank water, watched him find his moment. It came between the 2nd and 3rd courses, in the particular pause that formal dinners generate the lull when the immediate business of eating pauses and the social performance fills the gap. Pyron raised his glass. A toast, he said, loud enough for the table. To all our distinguished delegations, to our varied traditions. A breath, a pause calibrated to put weight on what followed, including humanities times, decorative times, military tradition. The eyes came to her face. They always did. Even the people who hadn't laughed looked to see what she would do with it. Laughter moved down the table. Not universal, not everyone, but enough the polite social kind, the kind that isn't really laughter but agreement that a hierarchy has been confirmed. Someone had established where the human sat in this room, and the laughter was the room saying yes, there. That's where. Ara raised her glass. She did not drink, just held it steady, looking at Pyron with the specific quality of attention that carried no heat, no anger, no injury. Just a flat considering patience, the way a person looks at a math problem. Before they begin, the laughter thinned. Stop. The glass stayed raised. Pyron's smile stayed on his face. By momentum alone, Ara set the glass down. From across the table, from the position of central presence that the entire room seating geometry deferred to, Thessalivar had been watching. Not the room, not Pyrrhon. Aura, her coloring had been running in the deep considered blue gold of prior sessions. But in the silence following the dropped glass, it shifted barely, fractionally, into something else. Something that did not have a name in Aura's briefing notes because it apparently did not come up often. Sovereign looked at Aura's hands, the scars on the knuckles, the deep ridging across the back of the right hand, the left, where two fingers had healed at a slight angle because there had been no one to set them correctly, and there had been no time to stop. Commander Voss, first time she had spoken Aura's name directly, first time she had offered a question rather than a declaration. How does a commander come by wounds like those? The table was quiet in the total way. Not politely quiet. The Sulivar musicians had paused again. The cultural attaché on Aura's left had gone very still. Aura looked at her hands. She had a short answer and a long answer, and about 11 answers that were technically accurate but strategically framed. She had been prepared for this question since the moment she accepted this assignment, had considered how to use it, what to make of it, whether to reveal or redirect or deploy. She looked at her hands and she thought about Kareth, and she set all of it down. Corridor collapse. Kareth. A pause. I had 3 soldiers I needed to get out. Nothing more. No elaboration, no before and no after, and no explanation of what 14 months looked like from the inside. The silence was different now. Thessalivar processed it with the visible, deliberate quality of someone recalculating. The Vareth sovereign had ruled for 30 years on the particular logic that visible damage meant failed protection, that a leader covered in scars had been in the wrong position, had made the wrong call, had let something reach her that proper command would have kept at a distance. She was looking at Aura's hands. A commander did not get those wounds from commanding. She got them from times doing, from going into the corridor herself, from pulling from the specific close-in work of getting 3 soldiers out of a collapse with her bare hands when there was no one else to do it. The framing did not fit the category. Thessalivar's coloring ran through 3 shades. Aura didn't have names for and settled into something very still and very dark. Pyrrhon cleared his throat. The sound of a man who had lost the room and could feel it and was reaching for something to say that would recover the moment. Well, he said, we all have our nobody. Looked at him. Not one face in the tables moved toward him. 17 delegations finding the ceiling, the food, the mid-distance space above their plates, anywhere but Pyrrhon and his reaching half-formed sentence. The silence was Aura's. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't performed for it, hadn't raised her voice or sharpened her expression or done any of the things people do when they want a room to listen. She had just told the truth in one sentence and let the room decide what it meant. Pyrrhon set his glass down. The 3rd course arrived. Aura ate something that tasted like nothing. She had a word for and watched the Sulivar musicians start playing again, very softly, something that might have been a different song than before, or might have been the same one slowed down. She thought about the corridor at Kareth, the specific smell of it, dust and metal, and the particular quality of recycled air when the recyclers are running below capacity, the sound of the structural groan that meant you had maybe 40 seconds before the next collapse, the weight of a person who can't walk. She put the thought away. filed it back where it lived. Thessalivar had not looked away. Aura ate her food, drank her water, let the room rebuild itself around the shape of what had just happened. She had not planned it as a move. That was the thing about the truth. When you stopped performing around it, it just sat there, solid and load-bearing, and the room had to rearrange itself to accommodate it or break. Trying. Most rooms rearranged. She finished her meal, declined dessert, and sat in the quiet of a table that had stopped laughing at a dinner that had stopped being a performance, and thought about gravitational anchors and transit corridors and the particular color that had run through Thessalivar's skin when she realized what she was looking at. Something careful, something that was going to want a private meeting. Aura was already prepared for that too. The request came at the 6th hour, delivered by the senior aide, not the young iridescent one, the older one. Deeper color, quieter movement. The kind of aide who had been around long enough to know that when the sovereign asked for something unusual, it was usually because something had shifted. A private meeting. Commander Voss and Sovereign Thessalivar. The Conclave's East Consultation Chamber. 1 hour. Aura was in the middle of annotating the resource sharing draft when the aide appeared at her quarters door. She finished the sentence she was writing, capped the pen. Tell her yes, she said. The East Consultation Chamber was smaller than the negotiating floor, which meant it was still larger than most places Aura had ever worked. The biology of the Varath architecture was more visible. Here, the walls were less finished, the bioluminescent veins closer to the surface, pulsing with that slow, rhythmic light that the Varath apparently found neutral and Aura found very slightly hypnotic. If she looked too long, she did not look too long. She sat down at the low table and put her hands flat on its surface and waited. Thessalivar arrived with 2 security officers who positioned themselves at the corners of the room the way security officers do when they know their primary could handle the situation herself, but protocol requires witnesses. The sovereign sat across from Aura, closer than they had been in the formal sessions, close enough that the color shifts in her skin were fully readable. She was running in something between blue-gold and a new color, a gray-violet, that Aura had not cataloged and did not have a briefing note for. Not yet. Your people sent you here knowing what we would think of your appearance, Thessalivar said. No preamble, no ceremony. Good. My people sent me here because I close deals, Aura said. That is not an answer to what I said. It's the only part that matters. Thessalivar studied her. You don't explain yourself. There's nothing to explain. The scars. The sovereign's voice was precise, not cruel, the precision of someone who wanted exact information and had decided that directness was the fastest route to it. I watched you in the session yesterday. I watched you at the dinner. You were presented with opportunities to contextualize them, to use them. You didn't take any of them. Aura looked at her. Contextualize them how? Establish sympathy, build narrative. A commander with visible sacrifice is a there are political uses for. I know what they political uses are. A pause. You chose not to use them, Thessalivar said. It came out almost like a question. I don't need to. The sovereign's coloring shifted, the gray-violet deepening, moving toward something more complex. She was working through a problem that the usual frameworks weren't solving. Ara had seen that before. Not often. Usually in people who were very good at what they did and had run into something their category system couldn't hold. Among the Varath, Thessalivar said, choosing the words with the care of someone who did not often choose them. This carefully. A leader who carries visible damage carries it as information. It tells those beneath her, this one was not protected, this one was reached. Whatever she commands, it is diminished by the evidence of her failure to remain whole. Ara listened. I assessed you by that reading. When you entered this chamber the first day, I assessed you as someone your own people had sent because they had no one better available or because they did not take these negotiations seriously, or both. I know what you assessed. Sovereign looked at her directly. And you said nothing to correct it. Why would I? The question sat between them. Because it was wrong, Thessalivar said. Yes, Ara said. It was. She let that land without softening it, not aggressive, just the flat fact of it. Set down the way you set down a document that says what it says and doesn't need your help saying it. The Karath system, Thessalivar said. Different track. Still thinking. What about it? You requested maps of it during the recess. It has no relevance to these negotiations, not directly. Then why? Ara turned her left hand over on the table. Not a gesture, just a shift in position. The scarring caught the light differently from underneath the Anara. Secondary corridors, she said. Your dominion holds them as strategic. Buffer. The question of what they're buffering against, that's in the Karath cartography. If you're looking from the right angle, silence, a long one. You've known, Thessalivar said slowly, since the first session, what the Anara corridors are actually for. I had a reasonable guess. The map confirmed it. And you said nothing. The Dominion didn't offer it. Ara kept her voice even. It wasn't my information to put on the table. I negotiated what was offered. 7 Kath is genuinely contested. The Anara corridors are a defensive screen for the Varath intersystems against a boundary pressure you haven't disclosed to the Conclave. The room was very quiet. I'm not asking you to disclose it, Ara said. That's not my business. What I'm telling you is that the corridor agreement, as it stands already, protects the screen. The human withdrawal from 7 Kath gives you the buffer depth you need without requiring you to explain why you need it. She put a document on the table, the revised corridor agreement with 3 additional clauses, clean, simply worded, nested. The existing framework. Read the second annex, she said. Thessalivar read it. The gray violet in her skin moved through something complex and settled into a shade. Ara was beginning to think meant recalibrating. You built in the protection without requiring the admission, the Sovereign said. It costs us nothing, and it gives you what you actually need. That's what a deal looks like. A long pause. Then Thessalivar said very carefully, the scars, not a question. Something else. You don't wear them as loss. Ara looked at her hands. The ridged knuckles, the slightly wrong angle of the 2 fingers on the left. The map of what 14 months looked like. When you survived them, every one of them is something I lived through, she said. She didn't say, unlike your unmarked ones, didn't say, you've never been tested. Not really, didn't say, the reason you read damage as failure is that you've never been in a corridor. Collapse with 3 soldiers in 40 seconds and no one coming. She didn't Need to, the sovereign's hand moved, an unconscious thing, barely visible. Fingertips touching the side of her own. Face, the smooth bioluminescent skin. Unmarked and perfect in 30 years removed from anything that could have reached her. Aura stood, the second annex is ready to sign whenever the Dominion is, she said. She nodded, not a bow, a nod. Equal to equal, and walked to the door. Behind her she heard nothing. Not movement, not response, not the sound of a chair pushing back, just the soft pulse of living walls, and a queen sitting alone in a room, her hand at her face, working through the particular problem of a framework that had held for 30 years and had just quietly been shown its own limits. Aura walked down the corridor. She had 3 more clauses to draft before morning. She was already thinking about all of them. The final session was scheduled for 3 hours. It ran 40 minutes. Not because the agenda was short, because by the time the delegates took their seats, most of the real decisions had already been made in the corridors and side rooms, and careful, quiet conversations that happened between the formal hours. The session itself was the ceremony, the signing, the statements, the mutual performance of having arrived somewhere together. Aura had been awake since the 4th hour, not from nerves. She had drafted the final clause, revisions by the 5th hour, reviewed the complete document by the 6th, and used the remaining time before the session to eat something, drink coffee, and read a geological survey of the Karath system that had nothing to do with the negotiations and everything to do with the next conversation she would eventually be asked to have. She filed it away, dressed, went to the chamber. The document that went onto the table for final review was 31 pages, standard for a negotiation of this scope. Corridor rights, resource sharing protocols, mutual defense, perimeters, monitoring procedures, ratification timelines. What was not standard were 3 specific sections, nested in the body of the agreement, that had not been tabled as separate agenda items during the formal sessions. Outer Reach Resource Sharing Clause, contained in its 3rd subsection, a Data Sharing Annex. Simple language, both parties agreed to share navigational and cartographic data for the corridors covered under the agreement, updated quarterly. In the Mutual Defense Protocol, a reciprocal notification clause. Either party detecting a boundary proximity incident in the defined zone would notify the other within 48 hours, with no requirement to disclose source or methodology. In the ratification timeline annex, a transit lane priority clause, signatory parties received first tier docking and transit access at each other's major stations, pending mutual approval on a case-by-case basis. Approval not to be unreasonably withheld. None of these had been debated. All of them had been agreed to, because all of them had been embedded in language that other clauses depended on, slipped into the connective tissue of the document during the drafting phase, and reviewed and signed off on with each delegation's preliminary seal during the working sessions over the previous 2 days. Aura had written all 3 of them. Lord Adjutant Pyron found it at page 19. She watched him find it. The way he read it twice, the second time more slowly. The small movement of his jaw, the look he turned on the document, as though it had done something to him personally, which in a sense it had. He looked up at her. She looked back at him. The transit lane priority clause, he said. This gives humanity first-tier access to you. Agreed to it on day 2, Ara said. Third recess, your preliminary seal is. On page 27, he turned to page 27. His own seal was there. Clean and official, pressed during the working session when the mutual defense protocols were being assembled. When the Kashin-Reach delegation had been focused on their argument with the Emranathi about sequencing and had reviewed the draft at speed, Pyron's jaw moved again. Well, Ara said just the word, nothing attached to it, no expression, no emphasis. It did not need any. Pyron was very quiet after that. He signed the final document in the exact position designated for the Kashin-Reach delegation, using the required formal stamp. Without another word, the signing moved around the table, deliberate, ceremonial, each delegation adding their mark in the order determined by the conclave. Standing protocol, Ara signed for humanity in the 7th position. Plain signature, her title underneath. The Human Consolidated Council seal, pressed cleanly beside it. She capped the pen, put it in her pocket. Thessalivar signed. Last is host sovereign, the Varith Prime. Speaker had completed the formal reading of the document, all 31 pages aloud, which was apparently a Varith ratification requirement and which took 40 minutes on its own. And the sovereign rose from her seat for the first time during a session. She was very tall. Ara had not forgotten this. But it was a different. Seeing it standing, the bioluminescent coloring ran in a deep formal gold, the color she had been told of official ceremony, of binding commitment, of words that were meant to hold. Thessalivar signed the document, then she gave the closing address, old language, ritual structure, the kind of speech that had a form, because it had been given 10,000 times, in 10,000 rooms at the end of 10,000 negotiations. Ara had sat through the equivalent in 7 other political traditions, and they all had the same shape: the acknowledgement of difficulty, the statement of common purpose, the forward-looking commitment. She listened to it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. And then Thessalivar deviated, a single line, added without announcement, slipped into the ritual structure the way a single true note enters a rehearsed piece of music, clean, deliberate, unmistakable. She used an old Varith phrase, the translation available to Ara through her earpiece was approximate, one who has crossed fire and remembers the shape of it. The phrase was directed, without ambiguity, at Ara. In Varith military culture, she had not known this before this moment. I would look it up later and find the full weight of it. It was the specific recognition given to a commander who had survived something that should have killed them and returned to function. Not survived and retired, not survived and broken, survived and continued. It was the highest military compliment in the Varith tradition. It was also Ara understood in the moment it landed, an apology, the only kind Thessalivar was built for. Not times I was wrong, never that, but times I see now what I did not see, offered in the language of the things she valued most, in front of 17 delegations. On the record, the room was very still. Ara received it, no expression, no nod of acknowledgement, no performance of being moved by it, because she was not going to perform any of that in this room in front of these people. She received it the same way she received most things, quietly, completely and without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her feel it. The session closed, the chamber began to empty, delegates rising, aides collecting documents, the slow dissolution of the formal into the informal, as 17 civilizations started the work of going home. Pyron left without looking at her. The Emranathi pods moved toward the exit in their particular drifting way. The Sulavar musicians played something that might have been a farewell. Ara stood at the window. The Varath capital spread below her, curving up at the edges in its wrong-looking way, alive and growing and expanding into spaces it hadn't occupied 5 years ago. The construction she could see from here, 3 new districts at least. The biological architecture in its early stages, pale and unformed and reaching. She looked at the bridges. The Varath built their bridges with a triple redundancy support structure, 3 anchor points where most species used 2 more material, more complexity, more time to build. But a Varath bridge, she had read somewhere, had never collapsed. Not one. In recorded history, she thought about that, about what it meant to build something for the weight of what might come, not just the weight of what was there now, about the decision to spend the extra material, do the extra work, because the bridge was meant to last. She thought about corridor agreements and data sharing annexes and the quiet way a document could hold more than it appeared to hold if you built it right. Behind her she heard footsteps, unhurried, the sound of someone who was not in a hurry because they had decided to be here. She did not turn around. Second annex, Thessalivar said. The notification clause, you built in protection for us that we did not ask for. It protects both parties. It protects us more. Ara looked at the bridges. Then we start from a better place next time. A long silence. There will be a next time, the sovereign said, not a question. There's always a next time. Ira watched a cargo transport cross one of the bridges below, unhurried, steady. The structure holding its weight without effort. That's why the deal has to be worth keeping. She heard Thessalivar consider that. She heard her leave. Ara stood at the window for another few minutes. The city below her was busy, alive, full of the specific movement of a civilization that was building towards something that had more it wanted to become. She put on her coat, picked up her briefing folder, the document inside, 31 pages, signed by 17 civilizations, was already being transmitted to the human consolidated council on a secured channel. They would read the 3 embedded clauses and understand what they meant. They would not be surprised. They had sent her because she closed deals. They knew how she closed deals. She walked to the door, stopped once to look back at the window, at the city and its bridges, at the living light pulsing slowly in the walls of the room. Then she walked out. The corridor was long and quiet and smelled like recycled air. The universal smell she thought of. Every enclosed space where serious things had happened. She had been in so many corridors. She walked to the end of this one and started thinking about the next.